Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hello, everyone.
Today, we're embarking on really a fascinating exploration into Genesis chapter 14, specifically verses 1 through 16. This passage, it vividly recounts Abram's, daring rescue of his nephew Lot.
It really does. A key moment.
Yeah. So we'll be uncovering the historical backdrop, some perhaps surprising elements of this ancient conflict, and, importantly, what these ancient events might speak to us today.
Indeed. And this seemingly straightforward story is actually quite rich with details.
Right.
Details that offer these glimpses into the ancient world.
Right.
And raise some really intriguing questions for us.
Okay, so let's begin by looking closely at the very first verse of Genesis 14. We're using the NIV.
Right.
At the time when Amraphel was king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim. What immediately strikes you about this opening?
Well, the list itself, these 4 Eastern kings, it's quite remarkable.
The names sound very ancient, almost exotic.
Exactly. And while, pinning them down precisely, linking them to specific historical figures, that remains a point of scholarly discussion. Folks like Hamilton and Sarna note this.
Right. It's tricky.
It is. But the names themselves, they really resonate with the linguistic landscape of the ancient Near East.
How so?
Well, take Kedorlaomer. That sounds very Elamite, linguistically. And Shinar, that's generally accepted, as Wenham points out, to refer to the region of Babylonia.
Okay.
So this opening, it immediately places Abram's story right in the middle of broader international power dynamics of that era.
Even if we don't know exactly who these kings were, historically.
Precisely. The exact identities might be debated. But the atmosphere, the context, it's clearly one of large-scale regional politics. It's like the author wants us to see Abram's personal story against this much bigger world event.
That's a great point. It's easy to just focus on Abram, but this verse, it plants him firmly in the middle of the geopolitical scene. So verse 2 follows, listing the opposing kings. These kings went to war against Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shimera, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. Anything particularly noteworthy about this second group?
Yeah, what's particularly interesting here, something scholars like Wenham and Sarna suggest, is that the names of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, Bera and Bersha, might actually be subtle Hebrew puns.
Puns? Really?
Yeah, carrying negative connotations. Bera could be linked to the Hebrew word for in evil, ra, and Bersha possibly to in wickedness, raya.
Wow.
So if that's the case, it's a fascinating literary touch, isn't it? Maybe subtly foreshadowing the moral character of these cities right from the get-go.
Like a little hint from the narrator about the kind of place Lot chose to live near.
Exactly. And also, these 5 cities, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela, which is Zoar, they form what later tradition called the Pentapolis.
Oh.
So it establishes the specific area of this conflict.
That's really insightful about the puns. That's another layer. Okay, moving on to verse 3. All these latter kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is, the Dead Sea. What makes this location significant here?
Well, the text itself gives us that crucial clarification, doesn't it? Identifying the valley of Siddim with what was later known as the Salt Sea, or, the Dead Sea, as we call it.
Right, the parenthetical note, that is, the Dead Sea.
Exactly. And that little explanation suggests the author might be using an older name and updating it for their readers.
Which could tell us something about when this was written or edited.
Potentially, yes. It could point to a later period. And what's more, as Westerman and Wenham discuss, the meaning of Siddim itself is a bit uncertain. Maybe cultivated land, maybe something else. Earlier interpretations even linked it to demons, though that might be based on textual variations.
Interesting.
But regardless of the exact meaning, the verse sets the stage geographically. The Valley of Siddim is where these 5 kings decide to make their stand.
Got it. The battleground. Verse 4 then gives us the reason for the war. For 12 years they had been subject to Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. What does this tell us about the politics back then?
Oh, this verse vividly illustrates a really common dynamic in the ancient Near East. You have a dominant power, a suzerain, and then you have subject states, vassals.
Like Kedorlaomer was the big power here.
Precisely. For 12 years, these 5 cities were under his thumb, paying tribute. So their rebellion in year 13, that's a direct challenge, a serious one.
Making a military response pretty much guaranteed.
Almost inevitable, yeah, as Walt de-emphasizes. The Hebrew words used here, theodon, served or subject to, and mara, rebelled, they're standard terms for this kind of political relationship and uprising.
So it clearly sets up Chedorlaomer's motivation for the campaign. It shows this complex system was already in place.
Definitely. It paints a picture of those power dynamics. So verse 5 describes the Eastern king's response. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him went out and defeated the Rephates in Ashtaroth-Karnam, the Zuzites in Ham, and the Emites in Sheva-Kiriathaim. Who were these people they hit first?
Yeah, the Rephates, the Zuzites, who might be the Zanzamim mentioned in Deuteronomy, right? And the Emites.
These were ancient peoples living in Transjordan east of the river. Deuteronomy actually describes them as, well, giants sometimes.
Really? Giants?
Yeah, or at least people of great stature. They're seen as some of the original inhabitants before later groups moved in. Commentators like Wenham Sarna and Walke explain this.
Okay.
So Ashtaroth-Karnaim was up in Bashan, Sheva-Kiriathaim near Moab. By defeating these groups first, Chedorlaomer basically secured his flanks.
Smart military move. Eliminate potential threats before tackling the main rebels.
Exactly. Show his strength, consolidate power in the surrounding areas.
Makes sense. Verse 6 continues their sweep south. And the Horites in the hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran near the desert. Where were they heading now?
Still heading south, they defeat the Horites in Seir, that's the region later associated with Edom, Esau's descendants, and El Paran. Well, that's likely near the northeastern Sinai Peninsula. Some even suggest maybe near Elath on the Gulf of Aqaba.
Wow, they covered a lot of ground.
They really did. It shows the impressive reach of their operation. They weren't just aiming to punish the 5 cities. They were reasserting dominance over a pretty significant territory.
It really underlines Chedorlaomer's influence, or at least his ambition. Okay, turning to verse 7. Then they turned back and went to En-Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they conquered the whole territory of the Amalekites, as well as the Amorites who were living in Hazazon Tamar. What's noteworthy here?
So now they turn back, heading northwest. They conquer the Amalekites and the Amorites. Now, the mention of the Amalekites here, that's a bit of a discussion point for scholars. Well, some, like Westerman, think it might be an anachronism because the Amalekites feature more prominently later, linked with Esau.
I see.
But Walke suggests it could refer to an earlier group, or maybe it's just the narrator using a term familiar to the audience. In Mishpat is identified as Kadesh, a key spot later in Israel's story, and Hazazon Tamar is often linked with En-Gedi, the oasis on the Dead Sea's western shore.
Okay.
So by this point, Chedorlaomer and his allies have basically subdued everyone around the rebellious cities. They've isolated them before the final showdown.
It sounds like a very systematic, thorough campaign. Verse 8 then sets the stage for that direct clash. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, marched out and drew up their battle lines in the valley of Siddim. Were they really in a position to resist effectively?
Well, imagine seeing all your neighbors defeated one by one.
Yeah, pretty intimidating.
So, facing this relentless advance, the 5 kings decide to meet them head-on in the valley of Siddim. Maybe, as Wenham suggests, they hope the local terrain might give them an edge. We'll see why in a moment.
Right, using the home field advantage, maybe?
Something like that. The fact they marched out shows some defiance, even if things looked grim. And the king of Sodom seems to be leading this effort.
Speaks to their desperation, perhaps. Verse 9 clarifies the forces. Quote, against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. What's the significance of the narrator pointing out the numbers like that?
Yeah, that 4 kings against 5 detail. It's drawn attention. Maybe it's to emphasize the Eastern coalition wasn't overwhelmingly huge numerically, especially after a long campaign.
Or maybe.
Or, as Walting suggests, it could be a literary thing to make Abram's later victory over these 4 kings seem even more impressive. You know, set it up like the odds were somewhat even initially, making Abram's win with his smaller force stand out more.
That's a neat perspective.
Also, notice Chedorlaomer is listed first here, reinforcing he's the main guy, even though Amraphel was listed first back in verse 1. A subtle detail, Westerman notes.
Ah, interesting. Okay, verse 10 describes the battle's outcome. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of the men fell into them, and the rest fled to the hills. How did the terrain affect things?
It is crucial. The bitumen pits, Omer, like asphalt or tar pits, they played a decisive role.
How so?
As the battle turned and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah started fleeing, the text says, some of the men fell into them. Wenham even notes the Hebrew could possibly imply the kings themselves fell in.
Wow, that would certainly hinder an escape.
Absolutely. These pits were a natural feature of the Dead Sea area, its geology. So ironically, the very ground they chose for the battle became a major reason for their defeat.
A vivid and kind of unfortunate image. Verse 11 details the aftermath. The 4 kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food, then they went away. Standard practice in ancient warfare, I assume.
Completely standard, yes.
Yeah.
Seizing the goods, the rojah, and the food supplies, that was just what victors did in the ancient Near East, as Sarna explains.
Why exactly?
Well, 2 main reasons. First, it enriches the victor's spoils of war. Second, it cripples the defeated cities, takes away their resources, makes it hard to recover, maybe prevents future rebellion. It's a clear show of dominance.
A harsh reality back then. Verse 12 then brings Abram's nephew into it. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions since he was living in Sodom. Why was Lot caught up in this?
Well, the text tells us plainly. He was living in Sodom. Remember back in Genesis 13, he separated from Abram.
Right, over grazing land disputes.
Exactly. And Lot chose the plain near Sodom, eventually moving right into the city, as Waskey notes. So his association with Sodom, its location, maybe its perceived prosperity, it made him vulnerable when the city fell. He got swept up in it.
Just caught in the crossfire because of where he chose to live. Highlights the consequences of choices, doesn't it?
It really does. Verse 13 describes how Abram gets the news. A man who had escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. Now Abram was living near the great trees of Mamre the Amorite, a brother of Eshcol and Aner, all of whom were allied with Abram. What's the significance of calling him Abram the Hebrew here? That phrase, Abram the Hebrew, it's quite unique and important here.
Why unique?
Well, as Spicer discusses, it's the narrator using the term, not an outsider, referring to Abram. That's unusual. It's led some scholars to think this chapter might draw on really old sources, maybe even non-Israelite ones.
Interesting.
Yeah, and Hamilton and Sarna explore links to the Habiru or Apiru people mentioned in ancient texts, sort of mobile groups, sometimes seen as outsiders, or maybe it links genealogically back to Aber.
Okay.
And noted his allies, Mamre, Eshcol, Aner. They're Amorite leaders, and they have a covenant with Abram. That shows his local standing, his resources.
So the Hebrew might emphasize his distinct identity, maybe even his outsider status, despite these local alliances.
That's a good way to put it. It highlights his unique position in this context.
Fascinating. Verse 14 then shows Abram's immediate reaction. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. What does this tell us about Abram?
His response is immediate, decisive. It speaks volumes about his loyalty, his sense of responsibility to family.
And the 318 men.
Yeah, the fact he could quickly muster 318 trained men born in his household, that shows significant social standing, considerable military capability.
Trained men, Thina. And what does that mean exactly?
It's an interesting term. Wenham suggests it might even have Egyptian roots, referring to loyal, trained retainers who could fight. The number itself, 318, it's very specific.
People must have theories about that number.
Oh, yeah. Symbolic interpretations, or maybe, as Walke suggests, it's just the actual size of his force. His pursuit is as far as Dan, way up north, even if the name Dan is an anachronism for Lachish, shows his determination. This wasn't a small effort.
Definitely shows him as a man of action and means. Verse 15 describes his strategy. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. What tactics did he use?
Classic move. A surprise night attack.
Dividing his forces, too.
Right. Dividing his smaller force likely aimed to create confusion, overwhelm the eastern kings, who were probably scattered now, maybe complacent, definitely loaded down with plunder. Sarna and Walke explain this.
Seems like a common tactic back then.
It was. A smaller, faster force hitting a larger, encumbered enemy at night. Smart strategy. And routing them, then chasing them all the way to Hobah, north of Damascus, it shows how complete his victory was. He didn't let them regroup.
A swift, decisive maneuver took them totally by surprise.
Absolutely.
Okay, finally, verse 16 concludes the rescue. He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and the other people. So, how successful was he?
Completely. Totally successful. The verse emphasizes he got back all the goods, Drolash, taken from Sodom and Gomorrah.
And Lot.
In fact, look back, safe and sound with all his possessions, and importantly, also rescued the women and the other people who'd been captured. So the impact went beyond just his own family.
Right.
That repeated phrase brought back the Hebrew verb shu. It really underscores the completeness of the restoration, as Walt Key points out. A powerful end to the drama.
It really is. This whole narrative is just packed with layers, isn't it? History, action, meaning. As we dig a bit deeper now, what are some of the unique insights scholars highlight about this particular passage? Things that maybe we don't always catch on a first read.
Well, one thing many scholars like Spicer, Sarna, Wenham really emphasize is the distinctly ancient feel of Genesis 14.
Ancient feel.
Yeah. They suggest it might draw on very old source material, maybe even, as we mentioned, non-Israelite traditions. The unique vocabulary, the big international scope, that reference to Abram the Hebrew by the narrator.
Yeah.
It all feels a bit different from surrounding chapters.
So maybe older traditions woven in.
That's one strong possibility. Spicer even sees literary patterns similar to Akkadian texts. And Westerman, he actually proposes that the chapter could be a later compilation, sort of weaving together separate stories, a battle report, Abram's rescue mission, and then the Melchizedek part that follows.
So not necessarily one single original narrative?
Possibly. Westerman suggests maybe a post-exilic final form, aiming to really glorify Abraham as this major figure on the world stage. These different scholarly views just show how complex and fascinating this chapter is.
Okay, and what about the historical accuracy of that Eastern alliance? That's something you imagine listeners might wonder about, these 4 powerful kings marching all that way.
Yeah, that's a big question. Pinpointing this specific alliance of 4 kings to one definite historical event, that's, well, still a challenge.
So we can't just find this war in Babylonian records.
Not easily, no. Sarna points out that while some names have parallels, like Arioch might connect to names from Mari, Tidal maybe to the Hittite name Tukulahia, the whole idea of major powers like Elam and Babylonia launching this huge, coordinated campaign against these small Dead Sea cities as one big imperial action. Well, many historians find that unlikely for the period.
So what might have been happening?
Spicer suggested maybe they weren't massive empires, but more like foreign adventurers focused on controlling resources like copper mines south of the Dead Sea. Maybe something like that happened around the 18th century BCE. And attempts to directly link Amraphel with, say, Hammurabi of Babylon. Those have mostly been discounted due to timing and name issues.
So the historical reality might be more complex than a simple reading suggests.
Very likely, yes. More nuanced.
And that term, Abram the Hebrew, keeps coming up. You mentioned Spicer thought the narrator using it was significant. Can you unpack that a bit more? Why is it such a key point?
Right. For Spicer, the fact it's the narrator's term, not just what others called Abram, is strong evidence for a source outside the main Israelite tradition. It's like an external perspective being preserved.
Okay.
And then you have the possible links, as Hamilton and Waltke discuss, either to those Epiru or Eabiru groups, these kind of mobile, sometimes marginalized people in ancient texts, or maybe it's a straightforward link back to his ancestor Eber.
So multiple possibilities for its meaning.
Exactly. But whatever the precise origin, using it here, this military story, it might really highlight Abram as this independent leader, operating a bit outside the normal Canaanite power structures, maybe underscoring how unusual his victory was.
That makes sense. And the number 318, Abram's men. Any consensus on that specific number? It seems very precise.
It is very precise, isn't it?
Yeah,
and it's fascinated people for ages. Some critical scholars might question it's literally exact, maybe suggesting it's symbolic or added later.
Symbolic.
Well, much later Jewish tradition used gematria number values for letters to link 318 to the name of Abram's servant Eliezer. But that's a much later interpretation.
Okay, so maybe not the original intent.
Probably not. Others, like Waltke, argue that precise numbers like this often give a sense of authenticity to ancient stories. For many evangelical scholars, the main point isn't necessarily hidden symbolism, but rather showing the significant size and capability of Abram's household. He could field a real fighting force.
So it underlines his status and resources.
Exactly. It shows he was a substantial figure, capable of this kind of rescue mission.
Okay, so this ancient story, filled with battles, kings, rescues, it feels distant, but it still speaks today, doesn't it? What are some key reminders for believers now, looking back at this?
Absolutely it does. One major thing is Abram's action itself. Swift, courageous, rescuing Lot, even after, Lot had arguably made a selfish choice moving towards Sodom.
He didn't hold a grudge.
No, it reminds us faith isn't passive. It demands active loyalty, righteousness, even at personal risk. Waltke and Baldwin really highlight this. We're called to put our faith into practice, acts of love, justice, care, especially for family or those in our community, even when it's difficult.
That sense of responsibility for kin really stands out.
It does. And it's relevant for how we treat our families, our church communities today.
And what about his alliances with Adner, Eshcol, and Memre, and how he treated them afterwards?
Yeah, that's another crucial lesson. It really underscores the importance of building relationships based on mutual respect, acting with integrity in all our dealings. Walke notes this too.
Even in conflict or after a victory.
Especially then. Abram didn't go it alone. He had allies, and he honored those commitments, sharing the spoils. It speaks volumes about partnership, fairness, generosity, recognizing others' contributions. That's vital in the church and how we engage with the wider world.
Good point. And finally, his victory itself. Against what seemed like much stronger opponents, it wasn't just his military skill, was it?
No, and that's maybe the most crucial point. Ultimately, as Sarna and Walke highlight, and as Melchizedek acknowledges later in the chapter, it was God's deliverance.
God's power enabling him.
Exactly. It's a powerful reminder for us today when we face spiritual battles or challenges that feel overwhelming, that our ultimate reliance has to be on God's power, God's provision. Our plans, our efforts, they matter, but we depend on Him for true victory.
That's a great takeaway. So this deep dive into Genesis 14.1 to 16, it's really shown us this rich tapestry, hasn't it? Ancient history, military drama, but also these profound lessons for faith.
Absolutely. Abram's courage, his active faith, the importance of godly relationships, and that ultimate reliance on God. It's all there.
And the scholarly insights into the text's background, its complexities, they just add another layer of appreciation, I think. Helps us understand it better.
Definitely. It enriches our reading and hopefully gives valuable perspectives for spiritual growth and for those listening who are ministry, for leadership too.
So for our final reflection today, maybe think about this. Where in your life, or perhaps in your ministry, are you facing situations that feel like overwhelming odds? Like Abram facing those 4 kings. Where might God be calling you to a courageous act of faith, trusting Him for the outcome?
And building on that, how can we, especially those in leadership or ministry, better embody those principles we saw in Abram? Loyalty, responsibility, integrity, particularly in how we engage with people in our communities, even those who might have made choices that led them into difficult spots. How do we reflect Abram's commitment to his kin, to his allies, in our own relationships today?